Hello and welcome back. Thanks for joining. My name is Berit and today I want to talk about the beauty that is Hoshin Engi. Hoshin Engi is a 23-volume manga by Ryu Fujisaki, published between 1996 and 2000. You might know this as Soul Hunter, which was the name of the anime series that was made based on this story in 1999. And I think I've read that there was even a new Soul Hunter series in 2018, but I haven't watched that, so I don't know. I first read this series when I was about 16-ish, I think. I borrowed it from my best friend when we were still in school, and yeah, I am rediscovering my love for it at the moment, so I want to share that with you. So Hoshin Engi takes place in kind of a historical fantasy sci-fi world. It is loosely based on the Fengshen Yanyi, which is in English called the creation of the gods or investiture of the gods, which is a Chinese epic from the 16th century. So according to the manga, the Fengshen Yanyi is one of the 4 classic Chinese novels, but Wikipedia kind of disagrees on that. According to Wikipedia, the 4 classic Chinese novels are Journey to the West, which I think was the inspiration for Dragon Ball, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which I very low-key want to read, Water Margin, which I honestly haven't heard of before, and The Dream of a Red Chamber, which I also haven't heard of before. Just very shortly, the Fengshen Yanyi tells the story of the decline of the King Zhou, if that's how you pronounce him, from the Shang dynasty, and the installment of Yifa as the new king of the Zhou dynasty. I'm probably mispronouncing the names, but I also find it very confusing that they are so similar. And the story of the Fengshen Yanyi includes both humans, obviously, and supernatural beings, you could say godlike beings. They are spirits. And at the end of this story, when Yifa is king, many of the fallen heroes are then given the status of gods, and that's why the story is called The Creation of the Gods. This is obviously a very short summary of what I read on Wikipedia, because I haven't read The Creation of the Gods myself, but I think it's kind of interesting to know what the story that we will talk about is based on. So let's move to the world of Hoshin Engi. In this world we have humans, but we also have supernatural beings who are called sennin and doshi. Doshi are the disciples who train to later become sennin, and sennin are more than human, kind of supernatural masters with special powers. Kind of godlike, if you will. And then the term sendo refers to both sennin and doshi together. There are also a special kind of sennin called yokai sennin, and those are sennin whose original form was not human. And their original form can just be about anything, any object that you can think of. And they have to be exposed to sunlight for several thousand years, and then they can gain the ability to transform into humans. And after a while they can do that permanently, so you don't see that they have been something else than a human before they became a sennin. Because a lot of sennin were humans before, but usually, of course there are exceptions to that, but usually the only humans who can become sennin are those born with a special bone structure, which is called the sennin kotsu. And that basically just means that they have a bone structure that is able to adapt to the kind of strength and power that a sennin needs. So the hero of our story is Taikobo, who is also on the cover of the first volume. And he is a lazy doshi, so someone who's training to become a sennin. And he doesn't do his training in the human world, but in the senin world, which is located in the sky. And there are basically two big places in the senin world which are rivals, and that is on the one hand the Kongrong Mountains, where Taikobo is from, and we also have the Kingo Islands, where most of his rivals are from. So in the beginning of the story, Taikobo is summoned by the chief of the Kongrong Mountains, Genshi Tenson, and he is appointed to fulfill the Hoshin Project. The situation in the beginning of the story is that King Chu of the Yin dynasty is bewitched by a very powerful senin called Daki, and Daki and her people are basically controlling the king and everyone around him, so they are pretty much running the country as they wish. And Taikobo's task is to defeat Daki, remove her from the human world, and seal the souls of 365 senin. And they have to be sealed in a place between the human world and the senin world, because they have to, of course, be removed from the human world so they don't interfere there anymore, but they also just kind of can't go back to the senin world because they're evil. So they have to be sealed in something which is called the Hoshin Dai, which is somewhere between the human world and the senin world. And Taikobo can seal their souls by killing them in the human world. So the ultimate goal for him is to defeat Daki and free humanity from her. And Taikobo has actually a very personal reason to agree to doing the Hoshin Project, although it's very difficult, because when he was still living in the human world, his tribe, the Jiang, were slaughtered by Daki, and he basically lost everything. And that happened when Taikobo was 12 years old. He's now 72, but he doesn't exactly look like it because he's not a regular human being, of course. So Taikobo is sent to the human world, and he also gets a companion called Supushan, and he's just about the cutest being in the whole manga, together with one other character that I will come to later. He kind of looks like a cross between a hippo and a moomin. But he gets very mad when other characters call him a hippo, which happens quite often, especially in the beginning. Supushan is a reiju, that is a magical beast that other characters mostly use as vehicles, so they ride them. And another thing that Taikobo gets to fulfill his task is a paupe. Paupe are basically the weapons that senin use, and they can have all possible forms and functions. And in the English version, which is the version that I'm reading, I think the paupe keep their original names, they're translated, which is quite cool, but it also gets kind of confusing because there are a lot of paupe in the story, and every single one, of course, has their own specific name. Taikobo's paupe is called Dashinben, which is the god-striking whip, and it's kind of an extendable stick that can manipulate the air, so he can, for example, shoot air pressure waves and even create a tornado. His archenemy Daki, for example, she has very different paupe. In her case, that's plural. I think she uses at least 3, if I remember correctly. So Daki is actually a yokai senin, and her original form was a vixen, which is very fitting for her because her character is cunning and intelligent. And she possesses the body of one of King Chu's queens. One of her paupe is actually also what she uses to bewitch the king. She has kind of a veil that she always carries around with her, and the veil produces a certain smell, and that's what bewitches the king and basically everybody who's around her. So that's how she stays in power, and almost nobody is immune to this spell, so it's an extremely powerful paupe. Now we will talk a little bit more about what happens, but I will mainly just talk about the first 3 volumes, which is A, because I don't want to spoil the whole thing now, and B, as of recording this, I have reread 12 of the volumes, so I'm just halfway through myself. I might make other plot-related videos, which are then spoilery later on, but not this first one. So Taikobo is sent to the human world to defeat Ducky and steal her soul and the souls of her minions. And the story follows Taikobo and the people he makes alliances with and the people that he fights. And generally Taikobo and his kind of core team, they constantly meet stronger and stronger enemies along the way, of course, so that they will constantly have to train their fighting skills. The first character that Taikobo meets on his way into the human world is Shinkoyo, and he's very interesting and super funny. Shinkoyo is also a doshi, but he is from Kingo Islands, and he is said to be the strongest one of all, even stronger than the so-called 3 great sennin, which we will meet a little later. But Shinkoyo kind of does his own thing. Nobody can ever be sure of his alliances, and in the beginning he acts mostly as a viewer and a commentator of what's happening in the story. And he goes to meet Taikobo basically because he's curious about him, and of course he also wants to test his strength. Shinkoyo is not only the strongest doshi, but he has also the strongest power peg called recommen, the Thunder Whip, and it looks a little bit like an ice cream cone, which I think fits his overall style very well. And he also has a Raiju called Kokutenko, and Kokutenko is the other cutest being in the world of Hoshin Engi, I think. The first encounter between Shinkoyo and Taikobo is very funny, but it ends with Taikobo fleeing because Shinkoyo is just much too strong for him. Taikobo then decides that he wants to defeat Ducky first, kind of start with the strongest enemy and then hope that her minions will basically give up so that his job will be easier in the long run. However, Ducky's sister, Okijin, decides that she wants to get rid of Taikobo for Ducky, so she goes to defeat him, but she underestimates Taikobo pretty badly, and she has to reveal her true form because it turns out that she's also a yokai sennin. And we learn that for a yokai sennin, revealing their true form is just about the biggest humiliation imaginable. And they only do that when they have suffered a very severe blow or severe wounds, so that they don't have the energy left to keep up the transformation as a human. And Okijin's true form is that of a stone lute, which Taikobo then takes to the capital Choka to present to Ducky, because he of course wants to provoke Ducky and lure her out so that he can either defeat her or at least get the emperor away from her and her temptation spell so that he will regain his sanity. In the capital, Taikobo also meets Hiko-ko, who is the Empress Busayo, so that's the chief commanding officer. Hiko is not a fan of Ducky either, but he's also very loyal to the emperor. It also turns out a little later that Hiko's sister is one of the king's many queens, so that also kind of ties him to the imperial court. But eventually, Hiko's clan will become some of the core allies of Taikobo. So anyway, Taikobo's plan to lure out Ducky and defeat her goes pretty much wrong because Ducky is very intelligent, and Taikobo ends up being caught and then sentenced to death in a snake pit. And that is, by the way, the content of volume 1. Taikobo is then rescued by Hiko and leaves the capital to make allies because he realizes that Ducky is just too strong for him, of course. He travels to a western region called Seiki, and on his way there, Taikobo makes 2 central allies. One of them is a human paupe called Nataku, and Nataku has an interesting backstory because he killed himself once to protect his mother from a dragon king, and then he was reborn from a lotus flower, and his heart is actually a paupe now. This makes him appear as heartless sometimes because he doesn't have a regular human heart. So that's also why Nataku is incredibly strong but has no feelings in the way that a regular human has feelings. And that also makes him sometimes appear as very aggressive and relentless, because he doesn't always understand why people act a certain way because of their emotions, of course. The other central ally that Taikobo makes is Yosen, who is another doshi from Kongrong Mountains. Yosen is also called the genius because he's the most talented doshi. But both Natako and Yosen don't join Taikobo straight away, but instead they go back to the Sennin world to train, and then they rejoin him a little later, but he meets those two very early on. Anyway, in the meantime, we also find out just how evil Daki actually is. Apart from bewitching the king, she also builds several torture sites where she can execute people. One of them is actually the snake pit. And we also find out that she even feasts on the dead bodies of the executed people. So the very thought of her being human in whatever remote way pretty much goes out the window very early on. Ducky even gets the, let's say, original main queen, or the queen who is also the mother of the kings, to kill herself. Which is why Hiko, the chief commanding officer, decides to get the princes out of the city, and he sends them to Seiki so that Taikobo can protect them and take care of them. Taikobo learns that the soul of the queen who killed herself actually was sealed in the Hoshin die, which doesn't make any sense because A, her name wasn't on the list, and B, she's a human. Generally, it turns out that the Hoshin list is way too short because it only contains 180 names and not 365, as it was said in the beginning. So Taikobo decides to go back to the Sennin world and confront Genshi Tenson, the chief of the Kongrong Mountains, to get an answer about what part of information is missing for him. And this is when we learn that the Hoshin Project is not just about killing Daki and sealing 365 souls. I mean, that still is kind of the goal, but it's also to prepare humans for the time after that, so that there won't be a revolt when such a strong leader as Daki is gone. So the idea is actually to make Seihakuko Shoki, who happens to be the lord of Seiki, the idea is to make him the new emperor, because he's the best candidate for that role. And what is more, Shoki must defeat Daki himself so that the people will accept him as the new ruler. So the battle kind of has to be fought out between humans. And the thing is that the Sennin have only been able to predict 180 of the 365 people who will die in the process of making Shoki the new king and defeating Daki. It is interesting, however, to see that the Sennin argue on the one hand that Daki needs to be removed from the human world so that she doesn't interfere, and that they want to create a world without Sennin. But on the other hand, they interfere pretty heavily in the human world because they send a doshi and then other Sennin also into the human world to make that happen. So that's kind of a interesting conflict. Generally, and this goes over the 3 first volumes, Taikobo makes Seiki his ally eventually, and then Seiki is declared the kingdom Jo, if that's how you pronounce it. And the main antagonists in the human world are then the kingdom Jo with Shoki as their king, and the kingdom Jin with the Emperor Chu and Daki, of course. And everything up until the point where those two parties are established as the main antagonists is the exposition of the story, and this takes up the first 7 volumes actually. Although I've just mainly spoken about the first 3. So the establishment of Seiki as Kingdom Jo and so on, that happens a bit later than what I talked about. As you can see, the story of Hoshin Engi is not exactly the most straightforward one. So although the main goal remains the same for the whole story, defeat Daki and seal the 365 souls to help humans build a world without sennin. There are about a zillion side quests where Taikobo makes new alliances, meets new people, and where the core group gets tested by stronger and stronger enemies. And one of the many things that I find awesome about Hoshin Engi is its genre mix. As I said, it's kind of history, fantasy, sci-fi, so it has this kind of historically inspired base with the classic Chinese novel. And most of the places where Hoshin Engi takes place, they are kind of, they look historical, so you can see that this is supposed to be circa, I don't know, circa Middle Ages China, although I think the story actually says that it's, 1500 years ago or something. And sometimes you also have maps in the story of China, but they will usually tell you that this is a fictional version of China at that time. So the story is very conscious about being a fictional version of China. It doesn't have the goal to portray some kind of historical accuracy or anything. But then Hoshin Engi is also very much fantasy based, because you have, for example, Supushan and Kokutenko, these kind of magical beasts that can talk and fly. And you have also the sennin, of course, who are supernatural beings. They are stronger than humans, they live longer, and some of them even changed their shape throughout time. And many of the Paope also kind of give off a magical vibe, I would say, because some Paope can manipulate the elements or manipulate the senses, for example. But then there are also some kind of science fiction elements, and that's what I think makes the mix so extremely intriguing. So for example, the 12 elite sennin, so the 12 chief sennin, so to speak, of Kongrong Mountains, they use these kind of robots to travel to the human world and also sometimes to communicate, and they are also called robots in the story. And also, although I've just said that many Paope give off a fantasy magic vibe, there are also some that give off a science fiction vibe, because some Paope, for example, look very much like futuristic weapons. There is one that I would just call a lightsaber, basically. And sometimes Paope also get opened to be modified or repaired, and then that looks very technical as well. Some characters are also kind of like Paope engineers, so it seems that their supernatural nature is not the only thing that allows the sennin to use their weapons, but they also experiment with them technically. And they also invent new Paope, which is also pretty interesting. So yeah, Hoshin Engi is, as you can see, wild in many ways. I hope I could give you a little bit of an introduction into the world and the plot of this super awesome manga, which I just love, and I just need to rant about it because I'm finding so many exciting things here. So I hope that you enjoy me sharing my love for it with you. I plan on doing a little series about this work where I will also talk more about the characters, the alliances, probably more about the plot as well. I hope this wasn't too confusing for you. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this little dive into Hoshin Engi and into the world of this story, and maybe I'll see you in the next video. Bye!